Hello, people of Earth and beyond. A warm welcome to all my friends out there from the other place. My name is Shannon, and today I am going to be talking about the first book in the Bartimaeus Trilogy, the Amulet of Samarkand. I'm going to be doing a review of this book, dividing it into a non-spoiler section and a spoiler section, and I'm going to break it down into 4 components, and those are the themes, the writing, the magic in the world building, and the characters. And I'm going to talk about each of those both in the non-spoiler section and the spoiler section. Before I just dive in, let's talk about the premise of the book. The Amulet of Samarkand follows a genie named Bartimaeus and his interactions with a young magician named Nathaniel. In this world, jinn and other spirits are summoned by magicians and bound to do their will. And these spirits have to take a physical form while they are on Earth, which is constantly painful to them. I want to make something clear about Bartimaeus and the other spirits for the more conservative readers out there. They are not demons. If you look at the actual definition of demon from Christianity, that's not what they are. Like, a demon is a malevolent spirit from hell that serves Satan. These spirits, they are from another dimension, and it's another world called the Other Place, but it's not hell as we know it. And they are not entirely evil. They're able to make choices good or bad, and I'll talk about that later on. And they don't serve Satan. So the magicians call them demons, which is a massive insult, but I just want to make it clear that that's not actually what they are. They are spirits, beings from another dimension. Anyway, Nathaniel summons Bartimaeus and charges him to steal the Amulet of Samarkand, and the plot takes off from there. So I'm sure you're wondering at this point, the big question, did I like this book? I love this book. I will admit that it took me a long time to get interested in reading it. My sister recommended it to me, and for years she tried to get me to read it and I just wasn't interested. And finally I told her that I would read it if she read something else, and I'm so glad that I finally picked it up and actually read it, because it is one of my favorites. I absolutely love not just this book, the rest of the series as well, but I'm just going to be talking about this one in this video. Yeah, I love it so much. Everything is so well done, and it's almost perfection in a book. It really is. And now I'm going to talk about why I like it so much. Starting with the non-spoiler section, for those of you who are just a little bit curious about this book and might want to know what it's about and what's going to be in it before you actually read it but don't want any spoilers, I'm going to start with the themes. Every book, every story has some kind of theme or at least a message, even if the book doesn't hit you over the head with it. And the Amulet of Samarkand is no different, and it's really good at not hitting you over the head with its theme, but the theme is morality. The main theme is morality, good versus evil. Basically, without getting too far into spoiler territory, Jonathan Stroud's original idea was to take the human hero and make him the antagonist, and take the demon and make him the good guy. And that idea isn't quite so clear-cut in the actual book, but I am more inclined to sympathize with the spirits who have been enslaved. A lot of the magicians in the book, who we would normally see as the good guys, are greedy and just trashy human beings. But there are characters like Bartimaeus and Nathaniel who prove that no one is purely good or bad. So there's just a lot of philosophy that you can extract from this book about morality. and I will get more into that later on. The actual writing. The plot is good. It's solid, it's pretty logical, there aren't any gaping plot holes. For the most part, the pacing is good. There are parts when no action is really happening and it just kind of slows down, so it drags a bit there, but I don't really mind because at that point it's mostly just giving us information that we actually need. But that would be like my one critique, is there are parts when the action is, when it just slows down a little bit. The interesting thing about this book is that it has two perspectives, and one of them is in first person point of view, the other is in third person. It doesn't really feel unnatural to switch between the two, and most times they switch on a chapter break, so it's really clear which perspective you're in. And it is done really well. One more heads up, though, is that there are footnotes, and they take a little while to get used to, but I think they're important. I think they work well in the story, and also they're generally well placed. They don't ever feel unnecessary. So, yeah, the overall writing is good. I love Jonathan Stroud's writing style. Alright, let's talk about the magic system and the world building. The world building in this book is pretty solid. Most of it is seen through expanding the magic system, and it's also seen through Bartimaeus' memories, because he's been around for 5,010 years. But I have a very clear understanding of this world and how the magic system works. And the world is kind of built up around the magic system, and it makes a lot of sense when you're reading it, so I think that's all very well done. And it's clear that Jonathan Stroud knows exactly how everything works, and because of that, the reader knows pretty much how everything works. So yeah, really well done there. And finally, for the non-spoiler section, we get to talk about the characters. I'm not going to talk about the characters in depth until the spoiler section, and even then I'm not going to go in depth with all of them because that would take a long time, but I will say this, they are all well developed, and the important ones are three-dimensional. The only thing that bothers me about the characters is the villain doesn't really have a backstory. He has a motivation. I feel like we could have gotten a little bit more about why he does what he does, or that kind of thing, but mainly he's motivated by greed and power, and that's enough for the story that they're telling. He feels developed enough, but we don't really see inside his head. It's not really a detriment because we get to focus more on the two protagonists. I just personally wanted a little bit more as to what was his stressor, if you will, like what made him kind of snap. That's all I have for the non-spoiler section, so if you're thinking now that you are intrigued by this book and you want to go read it, now's your time to sign off. Thanks for watching. If you don't care about spoilers, or you've already read this book and just want to hear the rest of my thoughts on it, I'm gonna get into some spoiler territory now and gonna go in depth with all of the elements that I just talked about. So let's get started. Circling back around to themes, like I said, the Amulet of Samarkand does not really hammer home its theme, but there is a lot of discussion of good and bad, right and wrong. Bartimaeus is a really sympathetic protagonist, and at first we see Nathaniel as the villain, but then we learn Nathaniel's backstory and sympathize with him. We meet other magicians like Lovelace and Underworld, who are the scum of the earth, disguised as human beings. And we also meet characters like Martha Underwood and Miss Lutyens, who show us that humans can be good. So it all really comes down to how people choose to act. There is a certain pattern of people who are after power, the magicians, acting mostly immorally. And so I guess that could be a theme too. Power corrupts, greed consumes. Keeping with that, though, we have Nathaniel, who is after power, because that's what he's been taught, like he wants to join the government someday. But he also cares very deeply about Mrs. Underwood and Miss Lutyens. He feels a lot of guilt about Miss Underwood's death, and he has a need to avenge it, which eventually leads to him saving a whole lot of people. Even if they are the worst humanity has to offer, we still tend to think of saving people's lives as a good thing. And the last thing that Bartimaeus says to Nathaniel before he's dismissed is that Nathaniel has a conscience, which is rare in a magician. So all of this just proves that this group of people that we see as the antagonists does not necessarily have to be so. Like, they can be good people. And of course, we're inclined to think within this story that they're automatically bad because they are enslaving the Jinn, but again, Nathaniel just proves that there's a blurry line there. Last thing about themes, I want to talk about Bartimaeus and the other Jinn. These spirits are supposed to be evil and malicious. That's how the magicians see them, and that's how the audience expects to see them, because we expect them to be demons. But again, they're not actually demons, and they're not actually all evil. Some are, like Footnotes, and they do kill humans from time to time, but it's usually to escape bondage. Throughout the book, it's clear that Bartimaeus does not want human pity and doesn't necessarily want the reader to think he is a good person. He keeps insisting that his only motivation is self-preservation, which is understandable. But then he does things like save a little girl from Footnotes when he actually doesn't have to. And we know that he's capable of getting along with humans. I mean, Ptolemy, anyone? His last comment to Nathaniel also emphasizes that he puts some stock in caring about others instead of just oneself. So I tend to see Bartimaeus as a character with morals that have been skewed as a result of 5,000 years in slavery, but obviously he is not completely evil. So I think the last thing that I can tack on to themes is the idea of blurred lines between good and evil, which I said earlier with Nathaniel, but, you know, it brings the question of perspective to morality. Like, is your morality based on your perspective from your experiences? There are also some themes of things not being what they seem, and appearances being deceiving, yada yada yada, but those are pretty self-explanatory, especially since Bartimaeus is a shapeshifter, so I'm not going to get into those. Alright, the writing. The writing, for the most part, is amazing. Jonathan Stroud has an almost poetic style that caters to a lot of great visual imagery. And let me just give you some examples. A bolt of feathered lightning plunged down out of the night and disappeared into the narrow space between two stalls. The candles that sprang from every available surface like a colony of toadstools. Indistinct black shadows writhed and roiled. The cloying weight of earth oppresses me greatly whenever I come into contact with it. Ice formed on the curtains and crusted thickly around the lights in the ceiling. As pale as a corpse, shaking like a dead leaf in high wind. There is a famous poet by the name of Seamus Heaney And if you've ever read one of his poems, you know that something he excels at is making his words sound like what he is describing. Jonathan Stroud does this too, with ice crusted thickly. You can hear the tinkling of the ice, and the shadows writhed, and many, many more examples. And both the visual and sound imagery are incredible. On to the points of view. Here's why I like the different points of view used for Bartimaeus and Nathaniel. It feels like Bartimaeus is really the one telling the story. I get to connect with him on a personal level while also learning about Nathaniel. It emphasizes which of the two the reader is supposed to identify with, but Jonathan Stroud is so good that we don't really feel disconnected from Nathaniel at all. Plus, Bartimaeus talking directly to the reader gives us necessary information, which leads me to the footnotes. Not everyone likes footnotes, and I get that. I didn't like them at first either, but I do think they are necessary and work really well in the Amulet of Samarkand. They give some vital information that otherwise would have to be introduced in info dumps, and they also give Bartimaeus a chance to comment on the narrative, which is actually really interesting and helps the reader connect with him even more. It just feels very personal when Bartimaeus includes the audience, and it adds something to the nature of his character, because Bartimaeus is capable of consciously thinking about several things at once. That's just part of his djinni nature, and so it gives him that layer to his character. I have to talk about the instances with the resistance. I personally love it when an author introduces elements that are going to be important in later books and sets up for a series. That being said, unless you know that there are 2 subsequent books, Nathaniel meeting Kitty and the attack on Parliament could be a little confusing. But still, neither event feels irrelevant because the characters keep talking about them after the fact, and in particular, Nathaniel having his scrying glass stolen forces him to trust Bartimaeus when they go to take down Lovelace. And finally, the pacing, which is where one of my only critiques comes into play. The only problem I really had with the pacing of this book was when there wasn't much action going on, and it seemed to drag a little bit. My most notable example is when we're all told about Nathaniel's childhood. On one hand, I get this. I want the whole picture of how Nathaniel was raised, because I think it adds to his character. On the other hand, it's just slow, and it makes me wonder if all of it was completely necessary, if I needed all the specific details. But that's probably just me. And that is why I say it's almost perfection in a book, because I just didn't care for the parts where it slowed down a little bit. Alright, the magic and the world building. I kind of already said everything I have to say about this one. I just feel like it's really well done, really well integrated. The magic system is especially intriguing, and the world is kind of built off of it. It's an alternate history, almost, of our world. Like, what would our world be like if there were magic? And there isn't necessarily a distinct time period. I know that it takes place, like, in the 2000s, just based on Bartimaeus's timeline, but it doesn't really feel like it does, because their entire history has been different, and that means the time period they're in is slightly different, which is really good. I feel like that's actually thought through very well. I get the feeling that a lot of the technology in this world would be antiquated to us, but that makes sense because technology doesn't need to advance so much if they have magic. I think the powers the magicians have and the powers that the spirits have are well established, and generally everything is just explained really well. And even though the story takes place almost entirely in London, we get a lot of information about what the rest of the world is like. Mostly from Bartimaeus, who has been all over, but still, like, characters just, like, mention something about the Americas or whatever. It's, like, it's all there. You can just tell that it's all there, all thought out. And so overall, it's a well-designed world and well-integrated world building. Last but not least, we get to the characters. I'm actually not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about each one, because I would have more to say if I didn't like them. It would just be a rant of complaining and pointing out all their flaws. But I like all of the characters. Basically, the characters that are not as fleshed out don't need to be, and when characters are fleshed out, it's done very well. Like, Martha Underwood and Miss Lucian's we don't get their whole backstory. They're just kind of flat characters. They stay the same, but we get enough about them, and they don't need that whole backstory. I do wonder how Martha Underwood ended up with Arthur Underwood, but it's okay. Like, they serve their purpose in the story really well without having to be fleshed out. And Nathaniel and Bartimaeus are both fleshed out really well, which is good. The story is really about them, and it helps the reader focus on them more, that they're the only ones we get to see inside their heads. I do want to talk about the main three characters very quickly. Starting with Simon Lovelace, I think that he's a good villain. He is a standard villain. We don't really get a backstory for him, which I think is that's my only other critique. We just know that he's fallen out of the good graces of the Prime Minister, and we don't know how. He's motivated by greed and power, but we don't know much else. And that's the thing, it's just, I want to know exactly what happened with him and the Prime Minister, and why he's suddenly gone from being very successful in the ministry to just not having as much power, because that's kind of his breaking point and what drives him to try and kill all the other magicians and seize power for himself. On one hand, he really doesn't need to be more developed, because he shows himself to be cruel and corrupt and very greedy, so we automatically root against him, which is fair. He's a horrible person. But I would like to know how he lost favor with the Prime Minister. But that's really all I have to know about him, because, again, the story focuses on Nathaniel and Bartimaeus, so it's not really too bad that we don't get inside the villain's head. He is also pretty smart, which is a quality I look for in a villain, but he should have guarded his house better so that Bartimaeus couldn't steal the amulet. Just saying. That's not really a critique, because, I mean, the plot wouldn't be able to happen if Bartimaeus couldn't steal the amulet, but I'm just saying that was, like, his one not smart thing. Moving on to Nathaniel. Nathaniel is actually likable in this installment of the trilogy. I appreciate how intelligent he is, even if he doesn't always have a lot of common sense. And in a way, he is relatable, because he had a horrible, horrible childhood, and we know he has a conscience, which makes him sympathetic. And again, I don't feel detached just because he's from, his perspective is from third person. He feels well-rounded, and everything about him makes sense as a character, and yeah, that makes him pretty likable for this book. That's all I can say about him in the first book. Finally, Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus of Uruk is my favorite protagonist of all time. I like witty and sarcastic characters. I have not encountered one more sardonic than him. I really vibed with Bartimaeus throughout the story. Jonathan Stroud does such a good job of making him both jaded and sympathetic, and I can't even begin to describe how he does that. But I love his wit, I love his sarcasm, and he's amazing and wonderful, and he is my one true love. He really is. I love him so much. He's also quite a complex character. I talked about earlier how he insists that he's not good, but then does good things. And there's just a lot of depth to him that you kind of have to read between the lines. He's almost an unreliable narrator, because he's telling you his version of events and what he was thinking, but his actions sometimes are a little bit different than what he says was going through his mind. And so he's very complex, and I love him. Alright, that is it. That is my review of Bartimaeus, the Amulet of Samarkand. I am reading the rest of the series right now, and so I'm planning on doing a review for The Golem's Eye and Ptolemy's Gate. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it inspired you to read this series. It really is amazing. Truly one of the best fantasy series I have ever read. One of the best series of all time that I have ever read. So I highly encourage everyone to read it. And thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I'll be doing more reviews in the future. Bye!